a teacher. I teach deaf students and have done so for 10 years. I'm an advocate for mental health among deaf individuals. I graduated from Gallaudet University. I have a bachelor's degree. From there, it's the world's only university for deaf students. I'm from Florida. Currently, I'm doing some research for my PhD at New York University. So soon I'm going to have to start my dissertation. It's a very heavy experience coming up. So my story really involves 3 different identities. I'm Black. And oftentimes, growing up, I was surrounded by a lot of white people in school. I knew that was part of my identity, and part of my family identity. I'm also a woman. I'm from a family who really encourages people to be self-supporting and self-sufficient. I'm also a deaf individual. So going to school, going to a university, being myself as a deaf person, and I needed to be able to develop a stronger identity in that realm. So as time goes on, I really switch back and forth between those 3 identities as my primary identifier. So I feel the need at this point to identify deafness and what deaf means. Oftentimes people think a person who is deaf cannot hear, has no hearing. Or they think about people as they age losing their hearing. Statistics show that youth are actually from 29 to 40. Oh, my PowerPoint. There we go. I'm not sure what happened there. Sorry about that. So deafness is actually a range from mild hearing loss to being profoundly deaf. So the deaf experience in and of itself, it is not just one note. It's not one same experience. There's a different range of experiences among people who identify as deaf. This image right here is an audiogram, and it measures hearing loss. So a person with a mild hearing loss misses a certain bit of audio information, and they may miss some aspects of spoken English. So even though it's a mild hearing loss, there are pieces that are just cut out of communication and make communication unrecognizable. Even though a person can hear things, it doesn't mean that they have access to speech entirely. So there are different aspects of deafness as well. So if one is talking about one's ability to hear, that's a medical perspective of deafness. Using a capital D with deaf is more of a deaf experience, a deaf identity, one being part of deaf culture, being part of the traditions and cultural experience of a deaf person, and recognizing oneself as a deaf person, and not necessarily seeing deafness as a disability. Throughout the world, there are 48 million people who identify themselves as deaf. I'm sorry, that's throughout the United States. And oftentimes, deaf people experience a lack of communication access within the community and within even their own homes. And oftentimes, deaf people have difficulty trying to figure out exactly who they are because of that lack of interaction with the community and environment that surrounds them. Oftentimes, hard of hearing people struggle to find a deaf identity because they feel as though ideologically they're split between the hearing world and the world that identifies as culturally deaf. So Audism is a term that was first created by a deaf professor, Tom Humphreys, in 1975. There goes my PowerPoint again. And Audism is the practice rooted in the belief that your hearing status or ability to hear gives you superiority or higher preference than someone who cannot hear. That's Audism. You know, if you think about racism, you think about ableism, it's a similar concept. It's that feeling or it's important to see how a particular person feels, and really you notice how they feel about other individuals by how they behave towards them. And so it's those actions that are important, and that's what's based in Audism. Dr. Ben Bahan, who is a deaf researcher, he's a professor at Boston University, used the term Audism to show that people oftentimes prefer spoken language and speech over sign languages, and that speech is the one defining aspect of a human being. If one does not use spoken language, then one is more of an animal than a human being. And in that way, oftentimes cultures look down on deaf people because they don't use spoken language. So throughout history, there have been a wide variety of terminology that has been Audist, hearing impaired being one of them. Hearing impaired is a fairly old term. It's still in use often today, especially within the school systems. Children are often labeled as being hearing impaired. That term, however, instantly labels someone as being broken if you're calling someone impaired. Moving on to deaf and dumb, that's just an old term that typically isn't used anymore. It's often used as a discriminatory term towards deaf individuals, saying that they're not able to learn or to function as a full, normal member of society. Another term that was used specifically among schools for the deaf was asylum, a school for the deaf. And the reason oftentimes asylum was attributed to schools for the deaf was it was more like a prison. It was a place where these children were placed or put. And oftentimes we're not given the educational opportunities that other children had because they were put in these places. Preferred terms for deaf individuals are deaf and hard of hearing. Some individuals prefer one term over the other and prefer to decide which label they will attribute to themselves, whether they are deaf or hard of hearing. It's a personal choice. Audism appears in a variety of different aspects of society, one of which is within the family itself, otherwise termed as familial audism. When deaf children are born to hearing families, oftentimes the families do not sign. 90% of deaf children are born to parents who are hearing. 90%. Of those 90%, 71.6% of those families do not learn to sign. So there are many deaf children who are living in hearing homes that don't have access to basic communication from the day they're born. So when deaf students enter preschool, kindergarten, first grade, this is the first time they may ever have full communication access. So when they leave school to go home, they have no communication for the rest of the day. So during that 8 hours when they're at school, that's when they have exposure to language and open communication, perhaps. And so how is it they're able to develop a full language when they're only accessing language 8 hours a day? So going to a greater level, we can talk about societal autism, moving outside the family. Oftentimes, hearing people just assume that other people are hearing. Because deafness is invisible. You can't walk down the sidewalk and look at someone and go, oh, that person's deaf. So automatically, a hearing person will often assume that another person is hearing, and also assume because of that they're being ignored when spoken to. So there's one specific example here of a deaf person who's working at a Publix grocery store, who actually is deaf-blind. And while she was working, someone came up and punched her because the person who punched her thought she was ignoring her when they addressed her, and didn't even think that perhaps she couldn't hear them when they spoke to her. You know, if with the first address of, excuse me, there was no reaction, perhaps that customer could have walked up to her and tapped her on the shoulder and gotten her attention. Another situation with societal autism and assuming someone's hearing is in North Carolina. A police officer was giving directives to a deaf person from behind. And of course, the deaf person, if they're from behind, couldn't hear them, didn't see them because they were behind. So the police officer tased this individual, and as a result of their interaction, this individual actually died because they didn't conform to and follow the directions of this police officer, and it resulted in them passing away. So as a result of this, there was one good repercussion in the sense that there is more training in recognizing that officers could be approaching deaf individuals and how to handle those situations more appropriately and safely. Another situation that comes up as far as societal autism goes is one's need to be a savior. A hearing person who sees a deaf person maybe in a grocery store or in another public area and feels as though they need to save this person and give them assistance and rescue them. It's really not appropriate to that situation. If a deaf person needs help, they'll certainly ask for it. But they're used to living in a hearing world and making their way through life, interacting the way they do, and don't necessarily need someone else to help them and guide them through what is a very normal everyday life. This is a note that I actually received from a person at the Department of Motor Vehicles. I was going to get a new license in a new state, and the gentleman told me I had to speak to them in order to get a new license. I'm like, how does speech, my ability to speak, affect my ability to drive? I have no idea. I did save that note because it was just a complete and utter shock that I was told that I needed to verbally, with my voice, answer his questions in order to get a license. Amazing. Another example of autism is medical autism. Last year, there was a hurricane. And oftentimes, those within the medical field don't hire interpreters. They try to rely upon the deaf person's family in order to interact with them, or to write notes back and forth in order to interact with the deaf person. They assume that all deaf people understand written English, as opposed to just providing an interpreter in order to have full communication. Oftentimes, they don't have certified, qualified interpreters for situations. This situation happened in Florida. This gentleman up here in the yellow shirt has a brother who's deaf. He knows some sign language, but he's not a skilled, qualified, trained interpreter. And so because they've used this individual as an interpreter, deaf people didn't have full and appropriate access to very important emergency information. This is also an issue with using children. Going into the emergency room, oftentimes the doctor will try to hand the paperwork to the interpreter. Ooh, that's not quite appropriate. The interpreter is there for communication access. That's all. They're not there to be the representative of the deaf person. Deaf people can take care of their own paperwork. Within the education system, autism is also seen, and it has been for many years. Back in 1880, the Milan Conference in Italy banned signing in educational settings throughout the world. So at that point, teachers began to punish deaf students for signing. If they caught those students with their hands up, those students would get a whack. They would be punished. And students were punished trying to use a natural form of communication, sign language. Fortunately, in the modern day, that doesn't specifically happen, but there's still quite a bit of autism within the educational system. Schools not providing access for deaf students, not providing interpreters, not providing materials with closed captioning. In my experience, working with teachers, I see teachers often show films in class without captioning. And students are missing out on that information and on that content and experience. Within vocational rehab, oftentimes people are told there's no funding. Vocational rehab used to fund students to be able to go to Gallaudet University. Again, it's the one liberal arts university in the entire world specifically for deaf students. And without that financial aid from vocational rehab, a lot of students don't get the opportunity to have a higher education in a setting that's most appropriate for them. One of the biggest issues with autism, however, is in the workplace. 48% of deaf people are looking for employment. Oftentimes, employers are afraid to hire deaf individuals because it's going to cost them more to have deaf employees. They need to have interpreters, and interpreters cost money. Deaf people struggle with whether or not they're going to schedule an interview and out themselves as deaf people because that may immediately screen them out of a job. I just got a new contract for my employment. The school certainly welcomed me, but they refused to provide interpreters. So they wanted to have a certified teacher of the deaf who's completely appropriate to work with the students. However, they wouldn't provide me with access. Another example here is when I was working with a mainstream program, and the school refused to hire an interpreter. However, there was a safety risk happening in the same time. The school was in a lockdown. A student had a gun. No one let me know. I had no communication access. So there's a high safety risk right there. What's going to happen with no information? So because of that, I contacted a lawyer advocating for my own personal rights due to the fact that I didn't have access to that information in the first place. And the disabilities rights lawyer told me, we're not going to hire an interpreter. Can you imagine that? I was shocked. Oftentimes, things that are said, just commentary that comes up is microaggressive. Well, you speak well for a deaf person. For a deaf person. You know, oftentimes deaf people may or may not have speech access. Maybe someone grew up hearing and has lost their hearing over time, so they've already had spoken language experience. You know, one can't assume that a deaf person can't speak. Dating and relationships, oftentimes hearing people don't want to spend a lot of time with a deaf partner, or they take over the partnership, the relationship, and the deaf person in the partnership becomes vulnerable to the hearing person's ability to take advantage of their hearing status. And then, of course, there's an issue with captions, which I like to call craptions, because basically, you know, captions are access to life. I just want to sit and be able to watch TV. And, oh, my time has run out. I'm so sorry. If I could say just one more thing. Please, I hope you did learn something from my speech today. And if you have any access, you'd like to provide access for deaf individuals, if you're an employer, if you're a deaf person, if you happen to have a deaf person who's qualified for the job, give them the opportunity they need for an employment. That is so very important. Just open the door. Thank you so very much.
Questions, we'll have to on the microphone, like that, or comments.
Since no one else said anything, this is not a question. I just really like your hair.
Oh, thank you, thank you.
Why did the lawyer decide that you didn't deserve somebody to assist you with an interpreter?
I'm really not sure. They just said they would not provide me with interpreting services. I actually printed out information from the Americans with Disabilities website proving my point, or that I should be able to have a lawyer. And they're like, oh, well, it's a free consultation. You can do that without an interpreter. We don't need to provide you one, despite the fact that I argued the ADA.
Regarding your point about how parents of deaf children often don't learn to sign, I was wondering about your feelings about parents of hearing children who teach signing like before they're able to speak, and so learn some signing then, but usually abandon it after they do start speaking.
Sign language is wonderful. It's great access for everyone. Research proves that it's very helpful to any child to develop language, any sort of language, whether or not they hear. Eventually, children who learn to sign, who don't use sign language as their primary language, don't use it at some point in their lives anyway. But those who have that foundational language very early in their life excel in school. So teach them sign language. It's a beautiful language. Why not?
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about something that I've talked with some friends in different spaces between deaf and deaf-disabled spaces, where something common that many deaf folks speak about as culturally deaf people is the idea of deafness as not being a disability at all, rejecting the language of disability and saying that being deaf means that you are a linguistic minority and it's about a culture and a community, not something that has anything to do with disability. But I also know of some other people who identify as both deaf and disabled who think that it's not a bad thing, like it's not oddist to say that being deaf makes you disabled, because of the idea that, well, there isn't anything wrong with being disabled to begin with. So claiming that term shouldn't necessarily mean that you're somehow demeaning or dehumanizing deaf people or stripping away cultural identity. And I'm a hearing person, so I know that it's definitely not like my place to try to dictate to anyone that's deaf what words they should or should not use or identities they should or should not claim. But I was wondering if you are familiar with that very specific tension between people who think of themselves as being deaf and totally rejecting disabled identity on the basis of being deaf, and deaf people who don't see a contradiction between identifying as disabled because of being deaf and claiming deaf cultural identity.
Well, my perspective on that is it's very important to respect people's decisions on their own identities. If people choose to identify as deaf and disabled, so be it. That's perfectly okay. Historically speaking, the word disability it carries a stigma with it. And often that stigma is, well, these people can't do this, this, and this. That's what dis means, disability. It can't. That's the implication there. So historically speaking, that's why that has come through. But it's interesting that the first deaf president of Gallaudet University is famous for saying deaf people can do anything but hear. And so many deaf people have embraced that quote. Oftentimes, deaf people are not even given the opportunity to show that they can do something. So it's important to respect people's choices for their own identities. And we really need to work on eradicating the stigma that goes along with the word disability. And I think that would go a long way in dealing with this particular struggle between two camps.
Yeah, I definitely don't disagree at all with the idea that we should always respect how other people identify. I guess, if you'll forgive the hopefully very short follow-up, my question is more about what do you see as the ways for us to be able to embrace that potential tension or respond to it, especially as people from outside the community? Like, 'cause it's not something that I should have an opinion on because I'm not from that community. But in terms of the tension, if that tension you think carries over into organizing between spaces that are very specifically about disability and spaces that are very rooted in deaf cultural identity that may have that very strong rejection of that terminology of disability. Like the fact that you're here today at an event that's called the Disability and Intersectionality Summit, but and so our communities end up often being lumped together, but there is that very strong rejection of the idea that disability is the stigmatizing term that many deaf people reject. And so how do you see us as being able to address that tension, if at all?
I'm not sure exactly how to eradicate that tension. You know, and in grassroots, deaf people oftentimes, that's where the tension comes from. People who are used to not wanting to embrace that particular label. So again, it all depends on the environment that you're in. I mean, there's no perfect environment. Or maybe there is. You know, individuals need to be able to claim terms that previously were stigmatizing and turn them into positive terminology. And embracing that term disability and making it a positive and making it a point of pride, I think that has a lot to do with dealing with that. And it's going to take time to ease that tension in that way. Thank you.
Okay, I'm sorry to be the time master, but unfortunately we're out of time. But we still have about 6 minutes, so free to continue to engage with John in this stage or the next stage, but I'll need to respect the next presenter's time to transition. But can we say like kudos, thank you?
Thank you. Thank you.